I first said we need to ask, what is the evidence for atheism? And here Dr. Slezak says that the only evidence against God's existence is the absence of evidence for God's existence. Now, this admission is highly significant because it means that he tacitly agrees that all of the traditional arguments for atheism, like the problem of evil or the incoherence of the concept of God, all of these arguments fail. The only argument for atheism is the absence of evidence for God. But the problem here is that the absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. To give an example, most cosmologists believe that the universe went through an era of inflationary expansion soon after the Big Bang. As yet, we have no positive evidence, however, for this era. But does that mean, therefore, that such an era did not exist? Well, obviously not. Or to give a more mundane example, we have no evidence that there is gold on the planet Pluto. But does that mean, therefore, that there is no gold on Pluto? Well, clearly not. So when, then, does the absence of evidence count as evidence that something does not exist? Well, theorists of knowledge agree that the lack of evidence for some entity X counts as positive evidence against X's existence only in the case that if X did exist, then we should expect to see more evidence of X's existence than what we do see. For example, the absence of evidence of a planet between Venus and the Earth is a pretty good reason to think that such a planet does not exist. Because if it did exist, we should have all kinds of evidence for it. Now, apply that then in the case of God. The absence of evidence for God's existence counts as evidence against God's existence only in the case that if God did exist, then we should see more evidence of his existence than what we do, in fact, see. In practical terms, what that means is this. If God exists, should we expect to see more evidence of his being than the origin of the universe out of nothing? The exquisite fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life,
Okay, so he's saying that there's only one unique way for life to exist. This, of course, is purely speculative creationist tosh. To demonstrate this point, I'm going to go to the microscopic level of molecular dynamics. Shown is a molecular dynamics simulation of the bee sting protein called melatonin. These simulations are routinely used and are very useful for the interpretation of experimental results and the predictions of microscopic behaviors of such systems. It's a well-established and mature field of chemistry. There's just one thing. There is no gravity whatsoever in these calculations, nor is there any gravity whatsoever in the more detailed quantum mechanical calculations. Gravity is about 1,000 billion times weaker than the electromagnetic force. It's an irrelevant factor in the molecular forces which determine molecular dynamics, which is why you can leave it out of the equation altogether. It's also notable that life is remarkably robust to the absence of gravitational fields, functioning almost as well on the Earth as it does in microgravity. Put simply, there is no reason whatsoever why you couldn't get life functioning perfectly happily in a universe with no gravity. There are just 4 forces that we are aware of. That's gravity, the strong, the weak, and the electromagnetic force. Now, I've just shown that gravity is not necessary for the functioning of life. Further, a recent paper has suggested that a universe without the weak force would look largely indistinguishable from our current universe. So half of the forces that we know about are not essential for the functioning of life. So much for the creationist statement that everything needs to be perfect for life to function.
The apprehension of a realm of moral and aesthetic values, the radical claims and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth from the dead, and the immediate experience of personal fellowship with God. Well, I think the answer is obviously not.